God!
All right, Smoky, move out.
They told the broken veteran his inheritance was nothing but a rotting curse atop a forgotten mountain. But they did not account for the instincts of his loyal German shepherd. Jax Harlan returned from the war with invisible scars and one faithful companion, Smoky. When an estranged uncle left Jax a decaying mansion in Blackpine Valley, the town's most ruthless tycoon offered pennies to tear it down. He thought the wounded soldier would run, but on their first night in the freezing darkness, Smoky's frantic digging beneath the floorboards unearthed a secret worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Before we uncover what lay buried in the dark, tell us in the comments where you are watching this story from today. The rain had been falling since long before the pale light of dawn attempted to break through the thick, bruised clouds above the Wyoming plains. It was a cold, unforgiving rain that never seemed to stop, soaking the cracked asphalt of an empty roadside gas station and drumming a relentless, rhythmic tattoo against the rusted metal roof of an old, faded pickup truck parked beneath a single, flickering yellow street lamp. Inside the cold cabin of the truck, Jax Harlan woke up with a sudden, violent jolt. For a terrifying moment, his heart raced wildly against his ribs, beating with the frantic rhythm of a trapped bird. His breathing came in fast, shallow gasps, the exact way it always did when the memories slipped past his defenses and the dream came back to claim him. In the chaotic space between sleep and waking, the innocent sound of the rain tapping against the windshield had warped and twisted into something else entirely. It became the distant, terrifying echo of heavy gunfire rolling through a dusty, sun-baked valley half a world away. Jax instinctively reached out, his calloused hands gripping the worn leather of the steering wheel. His knuckles turned stark white as he tightened his hold, anchoring himself to the present reality, squeezing until the phantom echoes of the battlefield finally began to fade into the quiet hum of the storm. "Easy," he muttered under his breath, his voice rough and heavy with sleep. "Easy now." Beside him, a massive, powerfully built German shepherd lifted his head from the passenger seat. The dog watched him with an intense, quiet intelligence, his ears swiveled forward, capturing every micro-expression on the man's face. His amber eyes were calm, steady, and filled with an ancient, knowing sorrow. "I'm okay, Smoky," Jax whispered after a long, stretching moment of silence. Smoky did not move right away. The dog had learned long ago through the smoke and the sand and the blood of their shared deployments that sometimes the man he loved said he was fine when his soul was actually tearing itself apart. Jax rubbed his face fiercely with both of his hands, pressing the heels of his palms into his eyes before letting out a slow, trembling breath that fogged the cold glass of the window. Outside, the heavy rain blurred the bleak world into streaked, moving shapes of gray and dull silver. The small-town gas station was barely awake, a solitary island of light in a sea of darkness. A lone cargo truck rumbled past on the distant highway, its massive tires hissing sharply against the wet pavement, throwing up fans of dirty water. This narrow, enclosed space had been their entire life for almost 14 months. Jax Harlan had once been an elite tactical operator, dedicating 12 years of his youth and his body to the service, surviving 3 brutal tours overseas. He possessed a chest full of heavy metals that he kept permanently sealed in a dark wooden box shoved under the passenger seat, a box he swore he would never open again. When he finally came home, he quickly realized that the war had stubbornly followed him back across the ocean. The clinical doctors, in their sterile white coats, called it severe post-traumatic stress disorder. For Jax, the reality was something far simpler and far heavier. The war had never actually ended, it had merely changed its location. Jobs came and went with painful predictability. Construction framing, overnight security patrols, heavy diesel auto repair. Each position lasted only until the sleepless, sweating nights caught up with him, leaving him hollowed out and dangerously exhausted. Eventually, the phone stopped ringing and the job stopped coming. The small, cramped apartment was the next thing to go, surrendered to unpaid rent and final notices. Now, there was just the unreliable engine of the truck, the endless stretching highway, and Smoky. Jax reached across the center console and began to slowly scratch the thick fur just behind the dog's left ear. Smoky leaned his considerable weight into the man's hand with a profound, quiet loyalty that required no words. "Just you and me, brother," Jax said softly, staring out into the rain. Smoky had served directly beside him during his final, most devastating deployment. The dog had been meticulously trained to detect hidden explosives and to track enemy movement through the most unforgiving, hostile terrain on Earth. But far beyond his official military duties, Smoky had saved Jax's life on more than one occasion, dragging him from the brink of absolute despair. When the military officially retired the dog after a piece of shrapnel tore through his shoulder during a chaotic ambush, Jax flatly refused to leave his partner behind. They had bled into the same dirt, and so they came home together. Now, they both slept in the cab of a rusted pickup truck, finding the only true peace they knew in each other's presence. Jax pushed open the heavy driver's side door and stepped out into the freezing downpour. The bitterly cold air bit instantly through his worn canvas jacket as he stretched his stiff, aching back, listening to the popping of his joints. The gas station clerk, a tired-looking teenager with heavy eyes, was just unlocking the front glass door. Jax walked inside, the small brass bell above the entrance, giving a weak, tired jingle. The interior of the store smelled overwhelmingly of burnt, stale coffee and the lingering scent of old motor oil. He moved to the back counter and bought the cheapest cup of black coffee they offered, along with a small, sealed packet of premium beef jerky specifically for Smoky. The clerk briefly glanced at the fading scars on Jax's neck, but wisely chose not to ask any questions. Silent, hard-looking men who lived out of their vehicles were not an unusual sight along this lonely stretch of the interstate. Jax stepped back outside into the morning gloom and dropped the tailgate of the truck, taking a seat on the cold metal. Smoky jumped down effortlessly beside him, his thick tail wagging in a slow, sweeping rhythm. They shared the dried meat in complete silence while the rain continued to fall in sheets around them for a few rare, fleeting minutes. The sheer simplicity of survival made life feel almost peaceful. The heavy noise in Jax's head faded to a manageable whisper, but the fragile peace was shattered when the local mail carrier truck pulled into the lot, its brakes squealing loudly in the wet air. The driver stepped out, holding his jacket over his head to block the rain, carrying a thick stack of sorted envelopes, and began placing them into the small row of rusted metal post boxes mounted along the exterior brick wall of the station. Jax rarely, if ever, received mail. Almost no one from his past life knew where he was anymore, and he preferred it that way. But when the driver turned away from the boxes and began walking directly toward the truck holding a single, thick, oversized envelope, Jax felt a familiar, cold knot form deep in the pit of his stomach. "Jax Harlan," the driver asked, his voice raised over the sound of the rain. Jax gave a slow, deliberate nod. The envelope handed to him was made of heavy, expensive cream-colored paper, the specific kind favored by high-end legal firms and banking institutions. His full legal name was printed meticulously across the front center. Jax turned it over slowly in his scarred hands, feeling its unusual weight. The embossed return address read, "The Sterling and Vance Law Group, Denver, Colorado." Jax's brow furrowed into a deep frown. "I'm going to need your signature for that one," the driver said, holding out a rain-spotted clipboard and a pen. Jax scribbled a messy, illegible version of his name on the wet paper and took full possession of the envelope. For a long moment after the mail truck drove away, Jax simply sat on the tailgate and stared at the heavy paper while cold rain dripped steadily from the frayed brim of his baseball cap. Smoky gently nudged his master's hand with a wet nose, sensing the sudden shift in the man's heart rate. "Yeah, I know, buddy," Jax said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the storm. He slid his thumb under the seal and opened the envelope carefully, pulling out a thick stack of official documents and a formalized letter. Jax began reading the crisp black text, the formal legal language taking a long moment to fully process in his sleep-deprived mind. "Dear Mr. Harlan, it is with deep regret that we inform you of the recent passing of your uncle, Elias Thorne. As his nearest surviving blood relative, you have been officially designated as the sole legal beneficiary of his remaining estate." Jax blinked rapidly, the rain mixing with the cold reality of the words, Uncle Elias. He had not heard that name spoken aloud in over 2 decades. Elias had been a quiet, deeply solitary man, a veteran of a much older, darker war who had mysteriously disappeared into the high mountains when Jax was still just a teenager, seeking refuge from his own insurmountable demons. Jax wiped the water from the page and kept reading. The remainder of the estate includes the entirety of the property historically known as Thorne Manor, located on the northern ridge overlooking Blackpine Valley, Colorado. Complete legal ownership has now been transferred directly to your name. Jax stopped reading, his breath catching slightly in his throat. Thorne Manor, he murmured aloud, tasting the unfamiliar words. Smoky tilted his head, his ears perked at the sound of the new name. Jax flipped past the formal letter to the supporting documents. Several faded black and white photographs were attached with a brass paperclip. They depicted a massive, sprawling wooden estate perched precariously on the absolute edge of a jagged cliff, overlooking a deep valley completely surrounded by an ocean of dark pine forests. Even in the old, faded photographs, the sprawling building looked ancient, imposing, and entirely isolated from the rest of the world. Another page in the stack listed the grim, immediate details of the inheritance. The sprawling property had been completely abandoned for nearly 20 years. Substantial back taxes were severely owed to the local municipality. Critical structural damage from decades of harsh winters was heavily noted. And at the very bottom of the final document was a bolded, underlined sentence that made Jax's jaw tighten defensively. The new legal owner must bring the entire property up to the county safety code within 90 days, or the structure will be permanently condemned, seized by the bank, and completely demolished. Jax let out a long, heavy breath that plumed into the freezing air. Well, he muttered bitterly. They do not make it easy, do they? Smoky sat tall beside him, his intelligent eyes watching Jax's face with unwavering focus. Jax looked down at the photograph of the imposing estate again, a giant, decaying mansion hidden deep in the isolated mountains, rotting timber, falling apart. It was entirely possible that the structure was worth less than the rusted engine of the truck he was currently sitting on, but despite the ruin, despite the debt, it was still something tangible. It was a solid roof, it was 4 walls, and perhaps, if he dared to believe it, it was a place to finally stop running and start over. Jax folded the thick letter slowly and carefully placed it into the inner pocket of his canvas jacket. He stared out across the wet gray highway that stretched endlessly toward the distant, unseen peaks of the Rocky Mountains. For the absolute first time in months, a new, unfamiliar thought crossed his troubled mind. Maybe the endless, exhausting road had finally led them somewhere that mattered. He reached out and aggressively scratched Smoky behind the ear again, feeling the thick, warm muscle beneath the fur. "What do you think, Smoky?" he asked quietly, the faintest trace of hope entering his gravelly voice. "Are we ready for a mountain?" Smoky's heavy tail thumped with a loud, hollow thud against the wet metal of the tailgate. Jax looked back at the printed photograph of Thorn Manor one last time. He had absolutely no idea yet that buried deep beneath the rotting wooden floors of that forgotten building lay an ancient secret powerful enough to change the entire trajectory of their lives. And he certainly did not know that somewhere deep within the shadows of Blackpine Valley, a ruthless, calculating man named Silas Vance was already watching, waiting, and preparing to take it all away from him by any means necessary. Jax finished the last bitter sip of his coffee, tossed the paper cup into a nearby rusted trash can, and stood up straight. "All right," he said, his voice finding a new, hardened resolve. "Let us go see exactly what kind of trouble your new mansion is going to get us into." Smoky leaped enthusiastically into the passenger seat as Jax climbed back behind the cold steering wheel. The old, tired pickup engine turned over slowly, coughing twice before finally rumbling to life with a loud, unsteady roar. The heavy rain continued to fall in relentless gray sheets as they pulled slowly out of the empty gas station and merged onto the wet highway, turning their compass west, heading straight toward the towering, snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains. Neither the broken soldier nor the battle-scarred dog knew it yet, but that long, quiet drive through the storm was about to lead them straight into the most dangerous, defining fight of their entire lives. The endless ribbon of the western highway stretched forward like a gray scar cut deep across the vast, empty expanse of the high plains, guiding Jax Harlan and his loyal companions steadily toward the jagged, imposing silhouettes of the Rocky Mountains. By mid-afternoon, the relentless rain of the morning had finally surrendered to a heavy, brooding, overcast sky that hung low and oppressive over the changing landscape. Smoky sat upright in the torn passenger seat, his sharp ears continuously twitching at the unfamiliar acoustic shifts of the changing altitude, his amber eyes completely alert to every passing shadow. The old battered pickup truck hummed a steady, vibrating rhythm beneath them, its overworked engine occasionally rattling with a sharp metallic cough whenever Jax pushed the heavy vehicle too hard up the steepening inclines. The truck had undeniably seen far better days, its frame dusted with the rust of a dozen brutal winters, but much like the broken soldier behind its steering wheel, it still possessed just enough stubborn life left within it to make the arduous climb into the heart of the Colorado high country. Jax drove in a heavy, contemplative silence for hours. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. The monotonous scenery outside the cracked windows began to dramatically shift. The flat, wind-scoured plains gradually surrendered to rolling, rocky foothills, and those foothills eventually thrust themselves upward into towering, dark green mountains that seemed to scrape the very belly of the gray clouds. Immense, ancient pine forests now lined the twisting, narrow roads, their thick canopies blocking out the fading afternoon light, and the thin air rushing through the vents felt noticeably colder, carrying a sharp, biting edge the higher they climbed into the atmosphere. The heavy scent of wet earth, crushed pine needles, and distant permanent snow filled the cabin. Jax rolled down his window an inch, allowing the freezing mountain draft to wash over his tired face. Smoky leaned his massive head toward the narrow opening, his black nose working rapidly as he meticulously processed 1,000 unfamiliar wild scents drifting down from the timberline. "You like that cold air, don't you, Smoky?" Jax murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration in the quiet cabin. The German shepherd thumped his heavy tail once against the worn fabric of the seat, his gaze never leaving the wild tree line. Jax had not set foot in the high mountains in many, many years. Yet there was something profoundly visceral about the heavy silence of the peaks that immediately dragged his mind backward in time, reminding him of harrowing covert training exercises and endless grueling patrols through the unforgiving terrain of the Hindu Kush. Long, agonizing hikes through hostile rocky valleys with absolutely nothing but the sound of the freezing wind howling through the rocks and the constant heavy weight of a rifle in his hands. It was a beautiful, terrifying landscape that demanded absolute respect and constant vigilance. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the chaotic overlapping noise in Jax's traumatized mind began to settle into a singular focused calm. Then, around a sharp, blind curve in the mountain road, a faded, bullet-scarred wooden sign suddenly appeared through the mist. "Welcome to Blackpine Valley, Colorado, elevation 9,000 feet. The isolated mountain town looked exactly like something tragic frozen in time, left behind and forgotten by the rapid progression of the modern world. Weathered dark brick buildings from the turn of the last century lined a single narrow main street. The vast majority of the storefronts were heavily boarded up with rotting plywood, their faded, peeling painted signs serving as silent tombstones hinting at thriving local businesses that had undoubtedly starved and closed their doors decades ago. A towering, rusted iron water tower stood ominously over the quiet town, like a silent, decaying watchman guarding a graveyard. Jax deliberately slowed the grinding truck to a low crawl as he rolled cautiously through the eerily quiet, snow-dusted streets. The few remaining people lingering on the cracked sidewalks noticed his arrival immediately. Deeply isolated, struggling small towns possessed a supernatural, almost predatory instinct for spotting vulnerable strangers. An older, weather-beaten man pumping fuel into a rusted tractor stopped his work completely, his eyes locked on the unfamiliar truck as it passed. A tired-looking waitress leaning heavily against the doorframe of a struggling, dimly lit diner narrowed her eyes with deep suspicion, crossing her arms defensively against the cold. Smoky noticed the shifting, hostile energy instantly. The war dog sat up much straighter, his muscles tensing beneath his thick coat, his eyes actively scanning the shadowed sidewalks and alleyways with the exact same quiet, deadly vigilance he had once utilized to spot hidden insurgent ambushes in war zones. Jax finally spotted a small, dilapidated county administration office, sporting a wooden sign that barely clung to its hinges. He parked the heavy truck by the curb, the engine dying with a final exhausted shudder. Inside the dim office, the air smelled overwhelmingly of dry rot, old dust, and cheap, burnt coffee. A single unbalanced ceiling fan spun lazily overhead, casting rhythmic, hypnotic shadows across the room. Behind a scarred wooden counter sat a woman in her late 50s, wearing thick reading glasses and a heavy wool sweater, her face lined with the deep stress of rural poverty. She looked up slowly as the large, scarred veteran filled the doorway. "Are you lost, stranger?" she asked, her voice carrying a dry, defensive edge. "Maybe I am," Jax replied with a small, tired smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "I am looking for the estate they call Thorn Manor." The woman's weary expression changed in a fraction of a second, her posture stiffening as if Jax had just uttered a terrible curse. She leaned back slowly in her squeaking chair, studying him with a mixture of pity and severe warning. "You must be the new owner the county got notice about," she stated flatly. Jax nodded once. "Jax Harlan." She scrutinized his worn clothing, the fading scars on his neck, and then shifted her gaze downward to the massive, highly trained war dog standing perfectly still by his left leg. "Well, she said quietly, almost to herself. I suppose that perfectly explains it. Explains what, exactly? Jax asked, his brow furrowing slightly. She let out a heavy sigh. It explains why Thorn Manor finally found a man unlucky enough to inherit its curse. Jax crossed his arms over his chest. Is the property really that bad? The woman stood up with a groan and walked slowly to a large, dirty window positioned behind the counter. She raised a trembling hand and pointed a finger toward the massive dark ridge of mountains rising sharply beyond the edge of the town. Do you see that highest black ridge up there, right near the cloud line? She asked. Jax followed her pointing finger. Far above the sunken valley, barely visible through the thick sea of dark pine trees, stood a massive looming shape perched precariously on the absolute edge of a jagged cliff. Even from several miles away, Jax could instantly tell the structure was absolutely enormous, an architectural giant brooding over the landscape. That is the Thorn Estate, the woman whispered. It has been entirely empty for 20 long years. After your Uncle Elias shut the heavy iron doors, the place just rotted into the earth. The county has been desperately trying to tear it down for a decade. Structural code violations, massive back taxes, safety hazards. If you do not magically fix it within 90 days, they send the bulldozers. For a moment, heavy silence filled the dusty office. You might want to seriously think about selling it today and walking away, she added quietly. There is a man, a corporate developer named Silas Vance. He has been aggressively trying to buy that exact piece of land for years. Jax felt a sudden familiar tightening in his stomach, a deep tactical instinct warning him of unseen maneuvers. Why does a wealthy developer care about a rotting house on a cliff? Jax asked. She shrugged her shoulders. He publicly claims he wants to build a luxury resort for the billionaires down in Denver, but personally, I think Silas Vance just wants to own the entire mountain and push the rest of us out into the cold. Jax tipped his faded cap politely, thanking her for the dark warning, and walked back out into the freezing wind. He climbed back into the truck, Smoky taking his position, and started the engine. They rolled slowly through the remainder of the town and found the single, narrow dirt road that led up the mountain. The crumbling pavement almost instantly gave way to deeply rutted gravel and slick, treacherous mud. The truck climbed upward at a grueling pace, tearing its way through the dense, suffocating pine forest. The road twisted sharply along the spine of the mountain, frequently offering nothing but a sheer, terrifying drop-off, thousands of feet to the valley floor, just inches beyond the tires. Jax gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles as the transmission whined in protest. Finally, the dense trees broke open, revealing the absolute summit, and there it stood. Thorn Manor. Jax brought the truck to a complete shuddering halt. The massive estate rose 4 imposing stories high directly on the edge of the cliff, a breathtakingly vast wooden structure constructed from thick, dark timber logs, featuring long, sagging wraparound balconies and sharp-pointed Gothic rooftops that looked as though they had been ripped straight out of a dark 19th-century fairy tale. But the relentless passage of time had been cruel and merciless to the manor. Faded, cracked paint peeled violently from the exterior walls like the diseased bark of a dying tree. Dozens of large, ornate windows were aggressively boarded up with rotting planks, while others were completely shattered, resembling dark, empty, soulless eyes staring down at the intruders. An entire corner of the heavy slate roof sagged dangerously under its own massive weight. The entire property radiated an aura of profound loneliness, an abandoned giant, forgotten by the heavens. Jax stepped slowly out of the truck, the bitter wind on the cliff immediately carrying the sharp, pure scent of pine needles and impending snow into his lungs. Smoky jumped down beside him, his paws hitting the frozen gravel silently. For a long, heavy moment, the broken soldier and the scarred dog simply stood there, staring upward at the beautiful, tragic ruin. Home sweet home, brother. Jax muttered under his breath, but suddenly Smoky stiffened. The dog's ears snapped rigidly forward. The thick fur along his spine stood straight up in an aggressive ridge, and a low, terrifying growl began to rumble deep within his broad chest, a sound born of pure, primal warning. Jax turned his head sharply, his combat instincts instantly flaring to life. Behind them, smoothly navigating the steep, muddy mountain road they had just barely conquered, a pristine, heavily tinted black luxury SUV suddenly appeared from the tree line. The massive vehicle rolled slowly, almost silently, up the gravel drive and parked aggressively just a few yards away, effectively blocking their only exit. The heavy driver's side door opened with a smooth click. A tall, impeccably groomed man stepped out into the harsh mountain environment, He wore a perfectly tailored, expensive dark wool coat, a silk tie, and polished leather shoes that looked ridiculously out of place on the muddy, frozen earth. His face was sharp, handsome in a predatory way, and adorned with a smile that was entirely smooth, dangerously confident, and completely devoid of any real human warmth. "Jax Harlan," the man said, his voice projecting easily and clearly through the cold, howling mountain air. "I have been waiting a very long time for you to finally arrive." Jax stood his ground, crossing his arms, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He said absolutely nothing. The stranger walked slowly forward, his expensive shoes crunching softly on the gravel. "My name is Silas Vance," he continued smoothly, gesturing with a gloved hand. "And I believe that you and I have a very profitable piece of business to discuss today." Smoky instantly stepped forward, positioning his massive body directly between Jax and Silas Vance, unleashing a deep, vibrating snarl that revealed the stark white of his sharp canine teeth. Vance paused his approach, glancing down at the aggressive dog, his practiced smile tightening just a fraction of an inch. "Well now," Vance said softly, his eyes narrowing. "It appears your furry companion does not like me very much." Jax's eyes grew cold and hard. "He is a highly trained war dog, Mr. Vance. He is an excellent judge of character. He only growls at active threats." Vance chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that was quickly stolen by the wind. "I suppose survival instincts are important in your line of work. But let us skip the pleasantries and get straight to the absolute point." He casually reached into the inner pocket of his tailored coat and pulled out a crisp, folded piece of paper. "I'm here to buy this entire estate from you right now." Jax did not even glance down at the offered paper. "Why would you want it? Look at it. It is rotting into the earth." Vance gestured grandly toward the massive dying structure, "because it is a massive financial liability to a man in your unfortunate economic position. The county will take it from you in 90 days anyway. I am simply offering to solve your problem before it destroys you. I will give you exactly $25,000, cash, right here today." The wind swept violently across the high cliff in a sudden, freezing rush. Jax looked from the slick, calculating face of Silas Vance to the massive looming shadow of Thorn Manor behind him. $25,000. The sheer weight of that number hit his exhausted mind like a physical blow. That money could change his entire life by nightfall. It could buy a small, quiet cabin somewhere far away from the noise. It could guarantee warm food, a soft bed, and a safe fenced yard for Smoky to rest his aging bones. No more sleeping in a freezing truck. No more running for one agonizing, suspended second. The financial temptation hung heavily in the freezing air, whispering promises of peace and immediate relief. But then, Smoky barked. It was a single, deafening, explosive sound that echoed violently like a gunshot across the deep mountain valley. Silas Vance visibly flinched, taking a sudden, involuntary step backward in fear. Jax noticed the subtle break in the man's arrogant armor instantly. He looked down at the dog who had saved him from the darkest corners of the earth, and then he looked back up into the predatory eyes of the billionaire developer. The hesitation vanished completely from the veteran's heart, replaced by cold steel. Jax shook his head slowly, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper that cut cleanly through the howling wind. "Keep your money, Vance. I think my dog and I are going to stay right here." For the first time since he had stepped out of his luxury vehicle, Silas Vance's practiced, arrogant smile vanished completely, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated malice. The mountain wind howled violently through the shattered dark windows of Thorn Manor, and somewhere deep inside the cavernous, rotting building, a massive wooden door slammed shut with a loud, hollow boom, sounding exactly like the striking of an executioner's bell. The heavy tires of the black luxury vehicle spun aggressively in the wet gravel, violently kicking up frozen mud as Silas Vance threw the engine into gear and drove back down the treacherous mountain road, leaving the vast brooding shadow of Thorn Manor far behind. Jax Harlan watched the vehicle descend until it was completely swallowed by the dense, suffocating curtain of ancient pine trees. The sudden, violent confrontation had left a familiar, metallic taste of adrenaline pooling in the back of his throat. He recognized the cold, hollow look in the billionaire developer's eyes, a look he had seen 100 times before on the faces of desperate, dangerous men who possessed the terrifying, absolute certainty that the entire world belonged to them. When the loud, mechanical growl of the departing engine finally faded into the howling wind, the profound, crushing silence of Blackpine Valley returned, wrapping itself around the ruined estate like a heavy mourning shroud. Jax placed a steadying hand on Smoky's broad, muscular shoulder, feeling the rapid pulse beneath the thick fur slowly return to a calm, steady rhythm. The war dog offered a low, soft whine, looking up at his master with eyes that perfectly understood the gravity of the unspoken declaration of war they had just initiated. "We are not running anymore." "Smoky," Jax whispered into the freezing wind, his voice carrying the immovable weight of a final, binding oath. "Let us go inside and see exactly what Uncle Elias left us to defend." Jax turned his back to the sheer cliff and walked slowly toward the towering, imposing front entrance of Thorn Manor. The ancient wooden porch violently groaned and protested beneath the heavy tread of his combat boots, the rotting planks bowing dangerously but stubbornly refusing to break. Up close, the sheer, magnificent scale of the architecture was truly breathtaking, a tragic, fading monument to a bygone era of immense wealth and profound isolation. Jax reached deep into the inner pocket of his canvas jacket and withdrew the heavy, intricately carved iron key that the Denver law firm had included with the estate documents. It felt unnaturally cold and heavy in his scarred palm, resembling a museum relic, far more than a functional tool. Smoky sniffed cautiously at the base of the massive double doors, his black nose mapping the perimeter, searching for any lingering scent of a threat. Jax slid the cold iron key into the rusted ornate lock. For several agonizing seconds, the internal mechanism stubbornly refused to yield, bound tightly by 2 decades of harsh winters and expanding rust. Then, with a loud metallic shriek that echoed sharply against the surrounding mountain peaks, the heavy internal tumblers finally gave way. Jax pushed his entire body weight against the heavy wood, forcing the massive doors to slowly creak inward. A thick, suffocating cloud of ancient dust instantly billowed out into the cold air, carrying with it the heavy, tragic scent of old, decaying timber, damp stone, and completely forgotten time. Jax stepped cautiously over the threshold, his boots leaving distinct heavy footprints in the thick gray carpet of dust that completely covered the floor. The grand lobby of Thorn Manor stretched out endlessly before them, a vast, silent cavern of faded elegance. A magnificent curving wooden staircase swept upward toward the shadowed second floor, its intricate railings draped in thick, ghostly curtains of spiderwebs. A massive crystal chandelier hung precariously from the vaulted ceiling, its hundreds of delicate glass prisms dulled and blinded by a thick, suffocating coat of dirt. Rows of heavy, rotting leather armchairs sat scattered randomly around the cavernous room, resembling silent, grieving specters attending a funeral that had ended 20 years ago. The profound, heavy silence of the massive interior felt oppressive, pressing down on Jax's chest with the physical weight of deep water. Smoky walked slowly and deliberately ahead of him, the sharp clicking of his thick nails against the hardwood floor echoing loudly through the vast emptiness. The German shepherd did not behave like a normal dog exploring a new home. He moved with the precise, calculated discipline of an elite military scout actively clearing a highly dangerous combat zone. His head moved in slow, sweeping arcs, his ears independently swiveling to capture the faintest acoustic anomalies, his nose drawing in the stagnant air in deep, measured breaths. Jax followed closely behind, his own combat instincts instinctively flaring to life in the shadowed, unfamiliar environment. They moved deeper into the belly of the manor, passing the crumbling wooden reception desk, where a row of tarnished brass room keys still hung silently on their numbered hooks. Suddenly Smoky stopped completely dead in his tracks, his entire muscular frame instantly locked into rigid, unmoving stone, his ears snapped sharply forward, aimed directly down a long, impossibly dark hallway that branched off from the rear of the main lobby. The hair along his spine rose into a stiff, aggressive ridge, and a low, vibrating rumble began to build deep within his broad chest. Jax froze instantly, his right hand instinctively dropping to his hip out of pure, ingrained muscle memory, searching for a weapon that was no longer there. He slowed his breathing to an absolute crawl, listening intently to the overwhelming silence of the dead house. "What is it, brother?" Jax whispered, his voice barely a microscopic vibration in the cold air. Smoky did not bark. Instead, the dog took 3 slow, deliberate, measured steps forward, his nose pressed tightly against the dusty hardwood floor. He was actively tracking a scent, pulling a microscopic thread of information out of the suffocating smell of decay. Jax retrieved a heavy tactical flashlight from his backpack and clicked it on, the brilliant white beam violently cutting through the oppressive darkness of the corridor. He followed the dog closely. The long hallway was lined with rows of closed, heavy wooden doors leading to abandoned guest suites, but Smoky completely ignored them all. The dog moved purposefully until he reached the absolute center of the corridor. There he stopped, dropping his nose directly to the floor, and began to forcefully scratch at the wooden planks with his heavy front paws. The loud, sharp sound of claws scraping violently against wood echoed sharply down the dark corridor. Jax knelt slowly beside him, shining the intense beam of the flashlight directly onto the floor. At first glance, the area looked completely unremarkable, simply another section of dusty, decaying wood, but as Jax brushed the thick layer of gray dust away with his gloved hand, the anomaly became instantly, glaringly obvious. The floorboards in this specific isolated 3-foot square were fundamentally different from the rest of the ancient hallway. The surrounding wood was dark, aged oak, worn completely smooth by decades of heavy foot traffic. But these specific planks were a slightly lighter shade, cut differently, and they sat just a fraction of an inch higher than the surrounding floor. They had been intentionally replaced, and more importantly, they had been hastily nailed down long after the original construction of the house. "Good boy, Smoky," Jax murmured, a profound sense of dangerous curiosity washing over him. He stood up and quickly retraced his steps to the reception desk, forcing open a small, rusted maintenance closet hidden behind the counter. Amidst the terrifying wreckage of broken mops and shattered glass, he found exactly what he needed, a heavy, solid iron crowbar, dark with age and heavy with potential. Jax returned to the center of the hallway and carefully wedged the sharp, flattened end of the heavy iron crowbar deep into the tight, uneven seam between the mismatched floorboards. He applied his considerable upper body strength, leaning his weight into the cold iron. For a moment, the old wood resisted with an agonizing groan, fighting to keep its buried secret in the dark. Then, with a loud, violent crack that echoed like a rifle shot, the rusted iron nails tore violently free from the joists. Jax forcefully ripped the heavy wooden planks aside, tossing them onto the dusty floor. Beneath the false floor lay a secondary, heavily reinforced wooden panel, completely flush with the surrounding support beams. Embedded deep into the absolute center of this hidden panel was a massive rusted iron ring. Jax wrapped his gloved hands securely around the cold iron ring, braced his heavy boots firmly against the surrounding floorboards, and pulled upward with every ounce of physical strength he possessed. The heavy trapdoor shrieked in violent protest, the rusted hinges screaming against the intrusion, before finally, heavily giving way. A massive, suffocating wave of incredibly cold, damp air instantly rushed upward from the terrifying darkness below, carrying with it the incredibly strong, overwhelming scent of wet earth, crushed stone, and something completely unexpected, a faint, metallic odor of deep, ancient minerals. Jax aimed the brilliant beam of his tactical flashlight down into the gaping black hole. A narrow, treacherous flight of rough-hewn stone steps descended steeply into the belly of the mountain, disappearing completely into the impenetrable darkness beneath the foundations of the rotting manor. Smoky did not hesitate for a single second. The brave dog immediately placed his front paws on the first cold stone step and began to descend cautiously into the terrifying darkness, his nose continuing to diligently track the strange scent. Jax took a deep, steadying breath, gripping the heavy crowbar tightly in his right hand, and followed his loyal partner down into the earth. The temperature dropped dramatically with every single step they took, the air growing heavy, dense, and unnervingly quiet. At the bottom of the long, treacherous staircase, the narrow passage opened into a remarkably wide, structurally reinforced underground tunnel. The walls were constructed of solid, brutally rough mountain granite, heavily braced by massive rotting timber supports that looked as though they had been harvested from a coal mine a century ago. Jax swept his flashlight slowly across the subterranean space. Stacked tightly against the damp stone walls were dozens of rotting, heavy wooden crates. He walked cautiously toward the nearest stack and wiped the thick layer of damp grime away from the splintering wood. Faded, barely legible stenciled lettering slowly appeared beneath the beam of light. Thorn Mineral Excavation, 1924. Jax frowned deeply, his mind racing to connect the fragmented pieces of the puzzle. His uncle Elias had not just been a solitary recluse hiding from the world, he had been actively sitting on top of an abandoned industrial excavation site. As Jax continued to scan the dusty crates, his light caught a dull reflection sitting on top of a small, overturned wooden barrel. He stepped closer and picked it up. It was a thick, heavy, leather-bound journal, its ancient cover heavily cracked and stained with decades of moisture and dirt. Jax carefully opened the brittle, yellowed pages. The incredibly neat, disciplined handwriting immediately identified the author. This was the personal, private diary of his late uncle, Elias Thorne. Jax turned slowly toward the back of the heavy book, searching for the final, most recent entries before the old man's death. The words he read, under the harsh white light of the flashlight, struck him with the devastating emotional force of a physical blow. The writing detailed the exact same paralyzing nightmares, the exact same terrifying phantom gunfire, and the exact same suffocating, absolute despair that Jax himself battled every single night of his life. Elias had returned from a brutal, nameless jungle war with his soul completely shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces, fleeing into the absolute isolation of the high mountains, simply because he could no longer tolerate the excruciating, overwhelming noise of humanity. But then, the tone of the ancient diary entries shifted dramatically. Jax read the old man's desperate, hopeful words with growing shock. November 14. The nightmares have finally stopped. For the first time in 30 years, my hands have ceased their violent trembling. The secret is the water, the deep water beneath the stone. I had samples secretly analyzed in Denver under a false name. The geologist was terrified by the results. The spring does not just contain standard geothermal heat. It possesses a completely unique, incredibly rare pharmaceutical-grade concentration of naturally occurring lithium, heavy magnesium, and unknown complex trace minerals. Soaking in the subterranean vapor actively calms the damaged nervous system. It physically repairs the profound neurological damage of extreme trauma. It is a natural, impossible miracle. And the corporate hounds have caught the scent. A man named Silas Vance has been sending aggressive agents to intimidate me into selling. They want to monopolize the healing. They want to bottle the miracle and sell it only to the billionaires. But I will die before I let them steal this sanctuary from the broken men who truly need it. If anyone from my bloodline ever reads this, you must protect the deep water. The mountain is the real treasure, and the water is salvation. Jax slowly lowered the heavy leather diary, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. The absolute magnitude of the revelation washed over him like a freezing tidal wave. Silas Vance did not want to build a simple, arrogant luxury resort. The ruthless billionaire wanted to completely monopolize and privatize a priceless, naturally occurring medical miracle. Vance was fully prepared to violently destroy the rotting estate and anyone standing inside it just to gain absolute total control of the incredibly rare mineral spring hidden beneath it. Smoky suddenly nudged Jax's leg, his nose pointing purposefully further down the dark, reinforced tunnel. Jax tucked the priceless leather diary safely into the inner pocket of his jacket and followed the dog. 50 yards deeper into the mountain, the tunnel abruptly terminated at a massive, incredibly thick circular iron door set deeply into the solid granite rock face. It resembled the impenetrable blast door of a subterranean military bunker, featuring a massive, heavily rusted iron wheel handle in the absolute center. Jax stepped up to the imposing barrier, placed both of his gloved hands firmly onto the cold iron wheel, and threw his entire muscular body weight into the turn. The ancient rusted locking mechanism fought back violently with a terrible grinding shriek of metal upon metal. Jax strained his muscles to their absolute breaking point, his boots sliding slightly on the damp stone, until finally the heavy internal bolt snapped back with a massive echoing thud. Jax pulled the heavy iron door outward. The very instant the seal was broken, a powerful, overwhelming rush of incredibly warm, deeply humid air washed forcefully over his freezing face. The air smelled profoundly clean, carrying the beautiful, soothing scent of rich earth and pure, hot minerals. Jax aimed his tactical flashlight slowly into the gaping darkness beyond the door, and the breath completely vanished from his lungs. The narrow, claustrophobic tunnel opened dramatically into an absolutely massive, breathtakingly beautiful subterranean cavern. The ceiling soared 50 feet into the dark, supported by towering natural pillars of smooth, water-carved stone that glistened brilliantly with heavy mineral deposits resembling glittering cascades of frozen white diamonds. But it was the center of the massive cavern that completely defied belief. A vast, deep, naturally occurring geothermal pool stretched across the stone floor. Its incredibly clear, pristine water glowing with a faint, almost magical turquoise luminescence. Thick, rolling clouds of pure white steam drifted slowly and hypnotically across the glassy surface of the underground lake, rising gently toward the high, vaulted ceiling. Jax stepped slowly, reverently into the warm cavern, completely awestruck by the impossible beauty hidden deep within the violent mountain. Smoky walked cautiously to the very edge of the pristine water, lowering his head to drink deeply from the warm spring. Jax knelt slowly beside the incredible pool, removed his heavy leather gloves, and cupped the warm turquoise water in his scarred, trembling hands, splashing it over his exhausted, deeply lined face. The physical sensation was completely instantaneous and absolutely profound. A deep, penetrating warmth immediately seeped straight into his bones, and for the absolute first time since he had returned from the nightmare of the war, the constant, agonizing physical tension that gripped his spine simply melted away into nothingness. The chaotic, deafening noise in his head quieted to a peaceful, perfect silence. Uncle Elias was right. This was not just water, this was absolute, pure salvation. But the fragile, beautiful moment of profound peace was violently, instantly shattered. Smoky suddenly jerked his head upward, water dripping from his jaws. The dog's ears snapped rigidly backward, his eyes widening in alarm, and a terrifying, vicious snarl ripped through the quiet cavern. Jax froze, instantly identifying the terrifying sound that the dog had detected from far above them, echoing faintly but unmistakably down the long, dark tunnel they had just descended, came the heavy, deliberate thud of combat boots, violently striking the wooden floorboards of the main hallway. Multiple men, heavy footsteps, moving with aggressive, tactical precision. Silas Vance had not waited. The corporate mercenaries had breached Thorn Manor under the cover of darkness, and Jax Harlan and his loyal dog were completely trapped deep beneath the earth. The heavy, rhythmic thud of thick rubber soles striking the ancient wooden floorboards far above them shattered the profound, miraculous peace of the subterranean cavern like a hammer violently smashing through stained glass. Jax Harlan did not panic. Panic was a dangerous, unpredictable luxury entirely reserved for the untrained and the unprepared. Instead, a cold, familiar veil of absolute tactical clarity instantly descended over his mind, burying the brief moment of spiritual healing beneath decades of deeply ingrained combat reflexes. With a swift, practiced motion, his right thumb depressed the heavy rubber switch on the tactical flashlight, instantly plunging the massive, steaming cavern into total, impenetrable darkness. The sudden absence of the brilliant white beam felt heavy and suffocating, leaving only the faint, ghostly turquoise luminescence of the geothermal pool to cast long, distorted shadows against the damp stone walls. Jax dropped to one knee, lowering his center of gravity, his breathing automatically slowing to a measured, silent rhythm. Beside him, Smoky mirrored his master's movement perfectly. The massive German shepherd crouched low to the wet stone floor, his muscles coiled tight like heavy steel springs, completely silent and invisible in the dark. The dog did not bark. He did not whine. He waited for the silent command. His highly trained mind shifting effortlessly from a state of rest into a state of lethal readiness. Jax reached out in the darkness, his calloused hand finding the thick, muscular neck of his loyal partner. He pressed his fingers gently against the coarse fur, a silent communication forged in the blood and dust of foreign deserts. "We move quietly," Jax breathed, the words barely a microscopic vibration in the humid air. Jax rose smoothly to his feet and began to retrace his steps through the pitch-black tunnel, relying entirely on his spatial memory and the faint drafts of cold air drifting down from the open trapdoor. He moved with the terrifying, silent grace of a seasoned apex predator, his heavy combat boots rolling softly from heel to toe to completely eliminate the sound of his footsteps against the rough stone floor. Smoky flanked him closely on his left side, his sharp claws finding silent purchase in the damp earth. As they crept back up the long, narrow passage toward the base of the stone staircase, the chaotic sounds from the manor above grew distinctly sharper, carrying the heavy weight of immediate danger. It was not a single intruder blindly wandering through an abandoned house. Jax could clearly distinguish the synchronized sweeping movements of at least 3 heavily built men, executing a deliberate, coordinated tactical search pattern. They reached the absolute bottom of the steep stone staircase. Jax paused, pressing his back flat against the freezing granite wall, listening intently to the heavy footfalls vibrating through the wooden ceiling directly above his head. The faint sweeping beams of powerful handheld flashlights flickered through the open trapdoor, cutting through the thick dust of the hidden hallway like pale, searching fingers. The men were speaking to each other in low, hushed tones, their voices lacking the nervous hesitation of local vandals. These were hardened, paid professionals executing a specific set of orders with ruthless efficiency. Check the structural supports along the primary load-bearing walls, a deep, raspy voice ordered, the sound drifting clearly down the stairwell. Mr. Vance was absolutely clear about the directive. He wants the primary charges set deep near the foundation blocks. If the veteran and his dog are currently inside the perimeter, that is their own fatal mistake. The entire estate burns to the ash tonight, and the structural collapse will permanently seal the lower anomalies beneath 1,000 tons of rubble. Jax felt the blood turn to absolute ice in his veins. The horrifying reality of Silas Vance's endgame crystallized perfectly in his mind. The ruthless billionaire developer had no intention of engaging in a protracted, messy legal battle over the property rights or the unbelievable value of the hidden mineral spring. Vance intended to completely erase Thorn Manor from the face of the earth, burying the miraculous healing waters and anyone who happened to know about them under a mountain of burning timber and collapsed stone. It was an act of pure, calculated corporate terrorism, disguised perfectly as a tragic mountain accident. Jax slowly drew the heavy, solid iron crowbar he had carried down from the maintenance closet, the cold metal feeling like a natural extension of his own arm. He looked down into the darkness at Smoky. The dog's amber eyes caught a faint sliver of light from above, shining with an unwavering, fearless loyalty. "Wait for the breach," Jax communicated through a simple, firm press of his hand against the dog's heavy shoulder. Jax placed his left foot cautiously onto the first stone step, distributing his weight with agonizing slowness to prevent the ancient rock from grinding. He climbed the steep, narrow staircase one agonizing step at a time, until his eyes were perfectly level with the rough, splintered edge of the wooden floorboards. Through the opening of the trapdoor, the long, dark hallway of the manor was illuminated by the erratic, sweeping arcs of 3 high-lumen flashlights. The men wore heavy, dark tactical gear, completely devoid of any identifying insignia, their faces obscured by black fabric masks. One of the mercenaries, a massive, broad-shouldered man, carrying a heavy steel pry bar and a thick canvas duffel bag, undoubtedly filled with chemical accelerants, stepped directly toward the center of the hallway. He stopped abruptly, the beam of his light locking onto the violently torn floorboards and the gaping black hole of the open trapdoor. "Over here," the massive mercenary called out, his voice sharp with sudden surprise. "The floor is ripped open. We have a subterranean access point." The other 2 men immediately ceased their search and jogged heavily toward the center of the corridor, their heavy boots thundering against the wood. The leader of the group, a lean man with cold, dead eyes visible above his black mask, drew a heavy, serrated combat knife from a tactical sheath strapped to his chest rig. The dull steel caught the harsh glare of the flashlight. "Vance said the old man might have dug tunnels," the leader muttered. "Drop a flare down there and see how deep it goes. If it leads to the water, we drop a secondary charge right down the throat of the hole." Jax knew with absolute certainty that he had completely run out of time. If they dropped explosives into the narrow tunnel, the resulting concussive shockwave in the enclosed space would instantly crush his internal organs and kill Smoky before the fire even reached them. The time for silent evasion had officially ended. It was time to introduce the corporate ghosts to the absolute horror of a cornered combat veteran. Jax exploded upward from the darkness of the stairwell like a violent force of nature. He did not yell or scream. He moved with the terrifying, silent brutality of a man who had fought for his life in the worst places on earth. Before the massive mercenary standing over the hole could even process the sudden movement, Jax swung the heavy iron crowbar in a devastating rising arc. The solid iron connected sickeningly with the side of the mercenary's right knee. The loud, sharp crack of breaking bone echoed violently down the hallway. The massive man let out a sudden, breathless grunt of agony, his leg collapsing entirely beneath his own immense weight. As the man fell forward, Jax used his forward momentum to drive the heavy, flattened end of the crowbar squarely into the center of the man's chest rig, launching him backward into the dusty wall with bone-shattering force. The man's flashlight spun wildly across the floor, casting crazed, spinning shadows across the chaos. "Contact," the lean leader shouted, aggressively slashing the heavy combat knife through the dark air as he lunged forward toward the opening. But Jax was not fighting this war alone. The very instant the first man hit the floor, Smoky launched himself from the darkness of the stairwell. The massive German shepherd cleared the top of the trapdoor in a single, breathtaking leap, an 80-pound missile of pure, unadulterated canine fury. Smoky completely bypassed the fallen man and drove his heavy chest directly into the torso of the third mercenary, who was desperately reaching for a weapon on his belt. The sheer kinetic impact of the leaping dog knocked the third man violently off his feet, sending them both crashing heavily onto the splintering hardwood floor in a tangled, chaotic mass of limbs and teeth. Smoky's jaws clamped with terrifying, bone-crushing force onto the thick fabric of the man's heavy winter coat, pinning his arm to the floor and thrashing violently, keeping the attacker completely neutralized in a state of absolute panic. The hallway descended into pure, terrifying chaos. The spinning flashlight on the floor created a strobing, nightmare landscape of twisting shadows and blinding glare. Jax ducked smoothly beneath a vicious, sweeping slash from the lean leader's combat knife, the serrated steel missing his throat by a fraction of an inch. Jax pivoted sharply on his heel, grabbing the leader's extended wrist with his free left hand, locking his grip like a heavy steel vise. With a brutal, twisting motion, Jax forced the man's arm downward, simultaneously driving his right knee violently upward into the mercenary's exposed ribs. The sickening crunch of cartilage filled the air. The leader gasped for oxygen, his eyes widening in sudden paralyzing shock, but he refused to drop the deadly blade. He was a professional, heavily trained in close-quarters violence, and he instantly countered, throwing his heavy forehead forcefully into the bridge of Jax's nose. Bright flashes of white light exploded behind Jax's eyes. The coppery taste of fresh blood instantly flooded the back of his throat. He staggered backward half a step, his grip slipping from the man's wrist. The leader recovered his balance instantly, his dead eyes narrowing with pure murderous intent, and lunged forward with a devastating, underhanded thrust aimed directly at Jax's unprotected chest. Smoky saw the lethal motion from the corner of his eye. The incredibly loyal war dog instantly abandoned his pinned target. He did not hesitate to calculate the danger. He simply reacted, driven by a profound, unconditional love that completely eclipsed any primal instinct for self-preservation. Smoky threw his massive body aggressively across the dark hallway, inserting himself directly between the rising serrated blade and the chest of his master. The sickening, heavy sound of sharp steel, violently tearing through thick muscle and fur, echoed through the dust-filled air. Smoky let out a sharp, agonizing yelp, a sound that completely stopped Jax's heart dead in his chest. The dog's momentum carried him forcefully into the legs of the leader, knocking the man off balance, but the terrible damage had already been done. A long, deep, jagged laceration had been brutally carved across Smoky's left shoulder and heavy flank. Dark, thick blood immediately began to pour from the terrible wound, matting his thick coat and staining the ancient wooden floorboards. The brave dog collapsed heavily onto his side, his breath coming in short, rapid, pained gasps, but he continued to growl. His teeth bared defiantly at the attacker who had wounded him. A profound, terrifying silence seemed to instantly fall over the hallway. Time slowed to an absolute, agonizing crawl. Jax stared down at the dark, spreading pool of blood expanding beneath his loyal companion. The man he had tried so hard to become over the last year. The quiet, broken veteran desperately searching for a peaceful existence, instantly and permanently died in that freezing, dusty hallway. What rose up from the ashes in his place was the lethal, unforgiving operator who had survived the most brutal combat zones on the planet. A man who possessed absolutely no mercy for those who harmed the innocent. Jax slowly raised his head, his eyes locking onto the leader. The mercenary saw the profound, terrifying shift in the veteran's posture and desperately tried to raise his bloodied knife for another strike. He was infinitely too slow. Jax closed the distance between them in a fraction of a second, completely abandoning the heavy crowbar. He launched his right fist with devastating, blinding speed, connecting with the precise center of the leader's throat. The man dropped the knife instantly, both hands flying to his crushed windpipe as he collapsed to his knees, desperately fighting for a single breath of air. Jax did not stop. He grabbed the heavy, thick collar of the man's tactical vest, hauled him violently to his feet, and drove his skull forcefully into the solid, heavy oak frame of the nearest door. The leader's eyes rolled backward into his head, and he slumped to the floor, completely unconscious, the threat permanently neutralized. The third mercenary, who had finally managed to untangle himself from the floor, took one terrifying look at the unconscious bodies of his two highly trained partners and the absolute raw violence burning in the eyes of the scarred veteran standing over them. Pure survival instinct completely overrode his corporate loyalty. He scrambled frantically backward, his heavy boots slipping wildly in the dust, scrambled to his feet and bolted in absolute terror toward the shattered front entrance of the manor, disappearing quickly into the freezing dark mountain night without looking back. The heavy, violent echo of the brutal confrontation slowly faded, replaced only by the terrible, ragged sound of Smoky's strained breathing. Jax dropped heavily to his knees, the adrenaline instantly abandoning his bloodstream, leaving him shaking with a terrible, consuming fear. He slid across the blood-slicked floorboards and gathered the heavy, wounded dog gently into his arms. Smoky whimpered softly, a heartbreaking sound of pain and profound exhaustion, and weakly rested his massive head against Jax's chest, trusting the man completely to fix the broken world. "Hold on, brother," Jax whispered, his voice trembling uncontrollably, tearing a long, thick strip of fabric from the hem of his own heavy canvas jacket. "I have got you. I am right here. You hold on." Jax pressed the thick makeshift bandage firmly against the terrible bleeding wound, applying heavy, direct pressure to slow the massive arterial bleeding. His scarred hands were entirely covered in the warm, dark blood of the only living creature on earth that truly loved him. As he knelt in the freezing, ruined darkness of Thorn Manor, surrounded by the unconscious bodies of corporate mercenaries, Jax Harlan realized with absolute terrifying clarity that Silas Vance had just made the final, most fatal mistake of his arrogant life. The ruthless billionaire believed he was simply engaging in a hostile corporate real estate acquisition. He did not realize that he had just forcefully awakened a sleeping dragon and initiated a bloody, unforgiving war that Jax would absolutely not lose. The freezing, dust-choked air of the hallway felt heavy and completely still, a suffocating silence that follows a sudden, violent explosion. Jax Harlan remained forcefully pressed against the blood-stained hardwood floor, his heavy hands maintaining constant, unyielding pressure on the makeshift canvas bandage, wrapped securely around Smoky's deeply lacerated shoulder. His breathing was ragged, pulling the cold, metallic scent of fresh blood and ancient decay deeply into his exhausted lungs. Beneath his calloused palms, he could feel the rapid, terrified thumping of the loyal war dog's heart slowly beginning to stabilize. The massive German shepherd let out a long, trembling exhalation, his amber eyes fluttering shut as the pure adrenaline of the brutal combat slowly drained from his muscular frame, leaving behind only the profound, agonizing ache of torn tissue. "You're going to be absolutely fine, brother," Jax whispered into the dark, his rough voice carrying a desperate, pleading edge that he had not used since the darkest, most terrifying nights in the desert. "I promise you. We are walking out of this mountain together." Jax meticulously tied the thick canvas strip into a tight, secure knot, ensuring the heavy pressure would hold the massive wound closed. He slowly rose to his feet, his muscles screaming in violent protest from the sheer physical exertion of the close-quarters fight. He cast a cold, unforgiving glance at the two unconscious corporate mercenaries lying motionless on the dusty floorboards. They were completely neutralized, removed from the equation, but a deep crawling sensation of absolute dread suddenly began to heavily wash over the back of Jax's neck. The combat instincts that had kept him alive for over a decade of brutal warfare were screaming a terrifying, silent warning into his mind. The chaotic skirmish had ended entirely too abruptly. The third mercenary had fled in absolute terror. Yes, but he had fled toward the front doors. Then Jax smelled it. It did not begin as a massive, roaring inferno. It began as a faint, sharp, entirely unnatural chemical odor drifting slowly down the long, dark corridor from the direction of the grand lobby. It was the distinct, toxic scent of industrial-grade chemical accelerant. Silas Vance had not merely ordered his men to secure the property. He had ordered them to completely erase it from existence. The massive duffel bag that the first mercenary had been carrying must have ruptured during the violent struggle, spilling highly flammable liquid across the dry, ancient timber of the foyer. The third mercenary, in his desperate, terrified retreat, had executed the final, devastating phase of the billionaire's ruthless contingency plan. A sudden, sharp crackle echoed loudly from the front of the massive estate, followed instantly by a terrifying, hollow, rushing sound, exactly like the sudden inhalation of a massive, unseen beast. A brilliant, blinding flash of pure, unnatural orange light violently erupted in the main lobby, casting long, twisting, demonic shadows down the length of the dark hallway. The fire did not simply burn, it exploded. The ancient, dried-out oak floorboards, the heavy, rotting tapestries, and the century-old, load-bearing timber columns instantly caught the violent flame, acting as perfect, explosive kindling. "We have to move right now," Jax commanded, his voice slicing sharply through the growing roar of the flames. He knelt quickly and slid his strong arms completely beneath Smoky's heavy muscular chest and hindquarters. With a massive agonizing heave, Jax lifted the 80-pound war dog entirely off the blood-stained floor. Smoky whimpered softly in pain, his heavy head resting completely against Jax's shoulder, trusting his master with his very life. Jax turned and began a desperate, heavy sprint toward the rear exit of the long corridor, moving as fast as his burdened legs could possibly carry him. The temperature inside the massive manor was rising at an absolutely terrifying, exponential rate. Thick, suffocating clouds of toxic black smoke began to forcefully roll along the high ceiling, descending rapidly toward the floor like a dark, crushing wave of water. The terrifying, deafening roar of the fire grew impossibly loud, sounding exactly like the roaring engines of a massive cargo plane preparing for takeoff. Jax reached the heavy wooden door at the far end of the hallway and threw his entire body weight violently against it. It did not move a single inch. He kicked the heavy iron lock with his thick combat boot, the impact sending violent shockwaves up his leg, but the ancient door remained absolutely solid. It had been chained and padlocked securely from the outside. Vance's men had systematically sealed the massive estate before they ever breached the interior. They had intentionally built a massive, inescapable wooden coffin. The heat was becoming physically unbearable, blistering the exposed skin on Jax's face and hands. The terrifying orange glow was rapidly advancing down the hallway, completely consuming everything in its path. Jax spun around, his eyes frantically scanning the smoke-filled darkness. The trapdoor, the hidden entrance to the subterranean world, was sitting completely exposed in the direct center of the burning hallway. It was their only conceivable avenue of escape. "Hold your breath, buddy," Jax yelled over the deafening roar of the destruction. He tightened his desperate grip on the wounded dog and charged directly back toward the rapidly advancing wall of fire. The intense radiating heat was absolutely suffocating, searing his lungs with every single panicked breath he took. Burning embers the size of coins rained violently down from the collapsing ceiling, scorching holes into his heavy canvas jacket. He reached the open trapdoor just as the heavy, ornate wooden frame of the nearest guest room violently collapsed into the hallway in a massive shower of sparks and shattered timber. Jax did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He practically threw himself and the massive dog down into the dark, gaping maw of the stairwell. He landed heavily on the hard stone steps, his boots sliding dangerously, desperately clutching Smoky to his chest to absorb the brutal impact of the fall. The very instant they cleared the threshold, a massive burning support beam violently detached from the ceiling of the hallway above and crashed down with earth-shattering force directly across the opening of the trapdoor, permanently sealing the entrance under 1,000 pounds of burning, impassable debris. They were completely entombed in the dark. Jax lay perfectly still on the freezing stone steps for a long, agonizing moment, desperately gasping for clean oxygen in the absolute pitch-black darkness. His entire body was shaking violently with the terrifying adrenaline of the narrow escape. Above them, the muffled apocalyptic roar of Thorn Manor burning to the ground reverberated heavily through the solid granite ceiling, shaking the ancient stone steps beneath them. Jax carefully lowered Smoky to the damp floor, quickly retrieving his tactical flashlight from his pocket. He clicked the heavy switch. The brilliant white beam illuminated the narrow, rough-hewn stone passage. "We made it under the fire," Jax whispered, coughing violently as his abused lungs desperately tried to clear the lingering toxic smoke. "But we cannot stay here. If the foundation collapses, we will be buried alive." Smoky struggled bravely to his paws, his injured left leg hovering painfully above the damp stone, refusing to bear any weight. The dog leaned heavily against Jax's leg for physical support, his breathing labored and shallow. Jax wrapped his strong arm securely around the dog's broad chest, effectively acting as a living crutch, and slowly, painfully began to guide them deeper into the echoing subterranean darkness. They passed the rotting wooden crates of the old mining excavation, the tunnel trembling violently around them. Small showers of loose dirt and small stones rained down constantly from the reinforced ceiling as the massive wooden structure above them began its final, catastrophic structural failure. The heavy iron door leading to the geothermal cavern was still hanging wide open, exactly as Jax had left it. They pushed through the opening, instantly enveloped by the profoundly warm, humid, mineral-rich air of the hidden underground lake. The cavern was completely untouched by the violent inferno raging violently above it. The faint, ghostly turquoise luminescence of the pristine water glowed softly in the dark, casting beautiful, rippling reflections against the towering stone pillars. Jax led the limping, exhausted dog directly to the edge of the incredibly clear pool. Smoky immediately lowered his heavy head, lapping desperately at the warm, life-giving water. As the dog drank, he accidentally shifted his weight, and his bandaged, wounded shoulder briefly dipped directly into the warm, steaming edge of the mineral spring. Jax reached out quickly to pull him back, fearing the warm water would cause terrible pain or terrible infection, but he stopped completely in his tracks. Smoky did not flinch. The dog did not pull away in agony. Instead, a long, profound sigh of absolute relief visibly rippled through the animal's massive frame. The warm, incredibly concentrated lithium and heavy magnesium compounds completely saturated the makeshift canvas bandage, instantly soothing the burning, torn muscle tissue and deeply numbing the excruciating pain. Uncle Elias had written the absolute truth. The water possessed a miraculous, profound healing property that completely defied modern scientific explanation. Smoky looked up at Jax, his amber eyes noticeably brighter, the terrible, paralyzing glaze of deep trauma slowly beginning to fade from his expression. "We are going to find a way out of this mountain," Jax promised the dog, dipping his own blackened, blistered hands into the miraculous, soothing water. The pain in his burned skin vanished almost instantly, replaced by a deep, vibrating warmth. But Jax knew that while the water could heal their wounds, it could not save them from suffocation if the air supply simply ran out. Jax pulled the heavy, cracked leather diary from his inner jacket pocket, carefully protecting the fragile pages from the damp air. He flipped desperately to the final entries, searching for any possible indication of a secondary exit. Uncle Elias had spent years exploring the subterranean network. He would never have intentionally trapped himself inside a single exit system. Jax's eyes scanned the elegant handwriting until he found exactly what he needed. "The deep water flows directly from the heart of the stone," Elias had written. "Follow the current outward. Where the hot water meets the freezing wind, the mountain opens her eyes to the western valley, a narrow fissure, heavily concealed by the ancient roots of the grandfather pine." Jax stood up, his flashlight beam aggressively sweeping the far, jagged wall of the massive cavern where the natural spring silently overflowed into a narrow, dark crevice in the solid granite. "Follow the current," Jax muttered to himself. He looked down at Smoky. "Are you ready for one last hike, brother?" The brave dog offered a single determined thump of his heavy tail against the wet stone floor. They moved slowly along the absolute edge of the glowing pool, the air growing noticeably colder and significantly thinner as they approached the narrow fissure in the rock. The passageway was incredibly tight, violently carved by thousands of years of rushing water. Jax had to turn entirely sideways, painfully scraping his broad shoulders against the freezing, wet stone, while gently coaxing Smoky through the claustrophobic, terrifying darkness. The sound of the rushing water echoed loudly in the confined space, masking the terrifying, muffled sounds of the estate continuing to violently collapse far behind them. For 30 agonizing minutes, they dragged themselves through the belly of the mountain, fighting against the creeping, paralyzing fear of being permanently trapped beneath the earth. The air grew steadily colder, biting harshly through their wet clothing and fur. Then Jax felt it. A profound, incredibly sharp draft of freezing, pure winter air forcefully striking his damp face. He pushed forward with a sudden, renewed burst of desperate energy, scrambling up a steep, slick incline of loose shale and completely frozen mud. The narrow tunnel abruptly widened, the solid stone giving way to a dense, tangled ceiling of massive, ancient tree roots. Jax pushed violently upward against the frozen earth, his scarred hands tearing at the heavy, suffocating soil until, suddenly, he broke completely through to the surface. Jax dragged himself out of the freezing earth, gasping greedily at the pure, freezing mountain air before reaching down into the dark hole to haul the exhausted, wounded dog up onto the frozen ground beside him. They collapsed heavily into the deep, fresh snow, staring upward into the chaotic, swirling darkness of the storm. They were sitting on a narrow, heavily forested ledge located several hundred yards down the steep mountainside from the absolute summit. Jax slowly sat up and looked back up toward the peak. The sight was absolutely apocalyptic. Thorn Manor, the magnificent, terrifying architectural giant that had stood for a century, was entirely gone. In its place was a massive towering pillar of roaring orange fire that aggressively illuminated the falling snow for miles in every direction. The intense radiating heat was palpable even from their distant hidden vantage point, a terrifying testament to the absolute destruction Silas Vance had ruthlessly unleashed. Vance truly believed he had won. He believed he had successfully burned the heavy burden of the past to the ground, permanently silencing the broken veteran and securing his own endless wealth. But as Jax sat in the freezing snow, gently stroking the wet fur of the loyal war dog who had bled to save his life, he felt a profound, unbreakable strength rising deep within his chest. The fire had aggressively destroyed the rotting wood and the rusted iron, yes, but it had completely failed to destroy the one thing that truly mattered. The mountain remained, the healing water remained, and Jax Harlan had finally remembered exactly how to fight. "Let it burn to ashes, Smoky," Jax whispered into the freezing night, his voice devoid of any fear, carrying only the absolute cold promise of impending retribution. "Tomorrow, we go to war." The freezing, chaotic wilderness of the high Colorado Rockies immediately embraced Jax Harlan and his wounded companion as they pushed themselves away from the hidden, root-choked exit of the subterranean fissure. The brutal winter storm that had been violently gathering strength throughout the long, terrifying night now unleashed its absolute, freezing fury upon the steep mountainside. Blinding, heavy sheets of pure white snow whipped mercilessly through the towering, ancient pine trees, driven by a howling, aggressive wind that cut straight through Jax's burned and bloodied canvas jacket like 1,000 microscopic blades of jagged ice. High above them, completely obscured by the violently swirling blizzard, the massive, roaring inferno of Thorn Manor continued to consume the century-old estate, casting an eerie, pulsating, demonic orange glow against the low-hanging clouds. It was a terrifying, apocalyptic beacon of absolute destruction, a silent testament to the ruthless, unforgiving lengths to which Silas Vance was perfectly willing to go to secure his dark empire. Jax fell heavily to his frozen knees in the deep, shifting snowbanks, his abused, smoke-filled lungs desperately burning as he aggressively gasped for the pure, freezing oxygen of the wild. His entire muscular frame was violently trembling, not just from the profound, bone-chilling cold of the mountain storm, but from the massive, sudden crash of adrenaline finally leaving his exhausted bloodstream. He looked down at his scarred, blackened hands. They were heavily blistered from the intense, radiating heat of the burning hallway and deeply stained with the dark, drying blood of his only true friend. Beside him, Smoky stood entirely still in the deep snow, his massive head lowered slightly against the punishing wind. The heavy canvas bandage wrapped tightly around the dog's torn shoulder was completely soaked with the miraculous, turquoise mineral water of the underground spring. Remarkably, the German shepherd was no longer limping with the agonizing, crippling pain he had shown earlier. The deeply concentrated, naturally occurring lithium and heavy magnesium had penetrated deep into the torn muscle tissue, providing a profound, impossible level of biological relief that completely defied logic. "We cannot stop here, Smoky," Jax commanded, forcing his exhausted, battered body back to its feet through sheer, unbreakable willpower. "If we stop moving in this storm, the cold will finish the exact job that the fire started. We have to make it down to the lower access road." Jax reached down into the deep tactical pocket of his heavy cargo pants and pulled out a heavy, double-walled stainless steel military canteen. Just before they had fled the beautiful, terrifying underground cavern, in a moment of pure, absolute tactical clarity, Jax had submerged the metal flask directly into the glowing, turquoise geothermal pool, filling it to the absolute brim with the heavy, miraculous water. He clutched the freezing metal container tightly against his chest, feeling the faint, residual warmth of the deep earth still radiating from the heavy steel. This small, unassuming canteen was the absolute key to everything. It was the undeniable physical proof of the mountain's incredible secret, and it was the only weapon Jax possessed that was powerful enough to permanently destroy the untouchable corporate empire of Silas Vance. The harrowing, treacherous descent down the sheer face of the mountain took 2 agonizing, excruciating hours. They moved with absolute, painstaking caution through the blinding whiteout, navigating the violently steep, frozen terrain entirely by pure combat instinct and the faint, guiding contours of the ancient earth. Jax slid down icy, jagged rock faces, tearing the heavy fabric of his clothing, while Smoky followed closely behind, navigating the treacherous footing with the profound, silent grace of a ghost. By the time they finally broke through the dense, suffocating tree line and reached the snow-covered gravel of the lower access road, the incredibly faint gray light of the impending dawn was just beginning to slowly bleed into the eastern horizon. Parked exactly where they had left it, partially buried beneath a thick, heavy blanket of fresh snow, sat the battered, rusted pickup truck. To Jax, the ugly, decaying vehicle looked like an absolute miracle of modern engineering. He brushed the heavy snow violently from the driver's side door with his frozen, bleeding hands and forced the cold key into the ignition. The old engine stubbornly refused to turn over at first, coughing and violently sputtering in the freezing air, before finally roaring to glorious, mechanical life with a thick, heavy plume of dark exhaust. Jax immediately cranked the internal heating system to its absolute maximum capacity, the weak blowers slowly beginning to push warm, stale air into the freezing cabin. Smoky climbed painfully into the passenger seat, curling his massive, exhausted body into a tight ball, his amber eyes watching his master with complete, unwavering trust. Jax slammed the heavy transmission into gear and began the long, dangerous drive down the twisting, icy mountain road, leaving the smoking, ruined grave of Thorn Manor far behind them in the clouds. The 3-hour drive toward the sprawling metropolitan city of Denver was an exercise in pure, agonizing endurance. The heavy highway tires slipped and violently fought for traction on the slick, black ice of the mountain passes, but Jax's scarred hands remained absolutely steady on the steering wheel. His mind was no longer consumed by the chaotic, terrifying noise of the war, nor the paralyzing fear of the past. For the first time in over a decade, his thoughts were completely clear, sharply focused entirely on a singular defining mission. Silas Vance had ruthlessly relied on isolation, violence, and profound intimidation to easily crush his vulnerable victims. Jax was about to forcefully drag the arrogant billionaire out of the comfortable, protective shadows and violently expose him to the blinding, unforgiving light of the public truth. The sprawling city of Denver finally appeared on the horizon as the morning sun fully broke through the heavy gray clouds. The bustling, modern metropolis felt entirely alien and deeply strange to the broken veteran after his terrifying ordeal in the isolated, primal wilderness. Massive glass skyscrapers violently reflected the harsh morning light, and thousands of hurried commuters crowded the busy sidewalks, entirely oblivious to the terrifying, violent war for absolute survival that had just been fought deep within the mountains only a few hours away. Jax navigated the heavy, congested traffic with practiced, tactical precision, finally parking the rusted truck in front of a completely unassuming, heavily secured concrete building located near the University District. The large, polished brass letters above the reinforced glass entrance read, "The Colorado Institute of Geological Sciences." Jax stepped out of the truck, the heavy steel canteen clutched tightly in his right hand. Smoky followed closely, his thick fur still matted with dried blood and melting snow, walking with a proud, unbroken dignity that commanded absolute respect. They entered the quiet, brilliantly lit lobby of the Institute. The pristine, sterile environment smelled strongly of harsh chemical disinfectants and fresh paper. Behind a large, curving reception desk sat an older man wearing a heavily wrinkled white laboratory coat, thick spectacles resting low on his nose, actively reviewing a massive stack of complex printouts. Dr. Harris looked exhausted, a man who had clearly spent his entire life meticulously searching for profound truths buried deep beneath the dirt. He looked up slowly as the massive, scarred veteran and his terrifying, battle-worn dog approached the counter. Dr. Harris instinctively pushed his glasses further up his nose, his eyes widening slightly at the intimidating, raw presence of the two survivors. "Can I help you?" the doctor asked, his voice hesitant, clearly unsure if he should immediately call for building security. Jax placed the heavy dented metal canteen deliberately onto the pristine glass counter. The loud metallic clink echoed sharply in the quiet lobby. "I absolutely need you to run a complete, comprehensive chemical analysis on this exact water sample," Jax stated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that left absolutely no room for negotiation or delay, "and I need the certified results immediately." Dr. Harris frowned deeply, looking from the scarred face of the veteran to the battered canteen. "Sir, this is a highly specialized state research facility. We do not generally conduct public walk-in testing for residential well water. You need to submit a formal request through the county health department and wait the standard 6 weeks for processing." Jax leaned his massive shoulders over the glass counter, his cold, uncompromising eyes completely locking onto the tired scientist. Dr. Aris, this is not residential well water. This sample was just pulled from an undocumented deep subterranean geothermal aquifer located directly beneath Blackpine Valley. Men with very large guns just burned a century-old estate completely to the ground and aggressively attempted to murder me and my dog just to ensure this water never sees the light of day. I'm asking you as a man of science to tell me exactly what it is that makes this water worth killing for. Dr. Aris stared at Jax for a long, heavy moment. The raw, unfiltered truth burning in the veteran's eyes was completely undeniable. The scientist slowly reached out with trembling hands and took possession of the cold metal canteen. "Wait right here," he whispered, turning quickly and disappearing through a set of heavy, secure double doors leading into the main analytical laboratory. Jax and Smoky waited in the silent, bright lobby for what felt like an absolute eternity. The ticking of the large wall clock echoed loudly, counting the incredibly tense seconds of their dangerous survival. Finally, after 45 agonizing minutes, the heavy laboratory doors swung forcefully open. Dr. Aris walked slowly back out into the lobby, but his demeanor had completely and entirely transformed. The tired, bored scientist was entirely gone. His face was stark white, completely drained of all blood, and his hands were violently shaking as he clutched a thick stack of freshly printed analytical reports. "Where exactly did you say you found this?" Dr. Aris asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of absolute scientific awe and profound, terrifying realization. "Deep beneath the rock of Thorn Manor," Jax replied evenly. "What is it?" Dr. Aris placed the complex, detailed printout onto the glass counter, his finger tracing a heavily highlighted row of complex chemical compounds. "Mr. Harlan, I have spent 40 years analyzing geothermal anomalies across the entire Western Hemisphere. I have never in my entire professional life seen anything remotely resembling this specific composition. This is not simply hot spring water. This is a completely naturally occurring, highly stable, pharmaceutical-grade concentration of heavy magnesium, rare earth lithium, and a highly complex, unidentified biological enzyme that completely mimics the absolute most advanced neuroregenerative medications currently being developed in modern medicine." Jax stared at the complex numbers on the page. "Explain it to me simply, Doctor. What does it actually do?" Dr. Aris took a deep, shaky breath. If a human being or an animal suffering from severe neurological trauma, deep muscle lacerations, or profound physical inflammation were to simply soak in a highly concentrated pool of this exact water, the cellular regeneration and nervous system stabilization would be almost instantaneous. It is a biological miracle. If the underground aquifer is as massive as you claim it is, the land sitting directly on top of it is not worth millions. He paused, removing his glasses. It is easily worth $500 million to the right pharmaceutical or luxury medical corporation. The staggering, impossible number hung heavily in the sterile air of the lobby. $500 million. Jax looked down at Smoky, realizing exactly why Silas Vance was perfectly willing to burn the mountain to ash. The ruthless billionaire wanted to completely monopolize the cure, to violently steal the miracle and sell it back to the broken world for an impossible profit. Jax reached out and firmly took the official, certified laboratory report from the counter, carefully folding the absolute proof into his heavy canvas jacket. "Thank you, Doctor," Jax said quietly. "You just gave me exactly the ammunition I need." But as Jax and Smoky turned and walked out through the heavy glass doors of the Institute, stepping back out into the freezing, bright morning air of Denver, Jax immediately stopped dead in his tracks. His terrifying combat instincts flared violently to life. Parked illegally directly across the busy street, idling menacingly beneath the heavy shadows of a tall parking structure, were three identical, heavily tinted black luxury SUVs. The exact same vehicles that Silas Vance utilized for his aggressive corporate intimidation. The heavily tinted window of the lead vehicle rolled down slowly, revealing the cold, calculating face of Silas Vance himself. The billionaire stared across the busy street directly at the broken veteran and the scarred war dog, his eyes burning with pure, unadulterated hatred. He had tracked them. He knew exactly what Jax was holding in his pocket. And he had absolutely no intention of letting them leave the city alive with the undeniable proof. Smoky instantly bared his sharp teeth, a low, terrifying rumble building deep in his chest. Jax placed a calming hand heavily on the dog's head. The old Jax Harlan, the man who had desperately fought in the chaotic, bloody deserts, would have drawn a weapon and aggressively charged across the street, seeking violent physical retribution. But Jax finally understood that Silas Vance could never be truly defeated with pure violence. Men like Vance thrived entirely in the dark, utilizing endless money to cover up their brutal sins. "We are not going to fight him in the street, brother," Jax whispered, a cold, calculating smile slowly forming on his scarred face. "We are going to drag him directly into the light." Jax turned away from the menacing vehicles, completely ignoring the billionaire's implied, deadly threat. He confidently walked down the busy sidewalk, Smoky remaining perfectly at his side. 2 blocks away, a massive, towering glass building proudly displayed the brightly illuminated logo of the largest 24-hour broadcast news network in the entire state of Colorado. Jax pushed forcefully through the heavy revolving doors of the busy media station, walking directly past the protesting security guards with the terrifying, unstoppable momentum of a loaded freight train. He marched directly to the main reception desk, slammed the certified official laboratory report down onto the polished wood, and looked directly into the terrified eyes of the young producer sitting behind the desk. "My name is Jax Harlan," he announced, his powerful voice completely silencing the chaotic, busy newsroom. "And I have the absolute, undeniable proof that the billionaire Silas Vance just aggressively burned a century-old mountain estate completely to the ground in a desperate, violent attempt to steal a $500 million medical miracle. Turn your cameras on right now, or I walk across the street and give this exact story to your biggest competitors." The young producer looked at the official, stamped document, looked at the heavily burned, bleeding veteran, and looked at the massive, terrifying war dog standing at his side. He frantically grabbed his heavy desk phone. "Get the main anchor onto the live broadcast desk right now," the producer yelled into the receiver. "We are breaking into the morning feed!" Jax stood perfectly still in the center of the chaotic newsroom as the bright, hot studio lights violently flared to life around him. He looked down at Smoky, the loyal companion who had dragged him from the terrifying edge of absolute despair, who had bled to save his life in the dark, and who had faithfully guided him out of the burning mountain. The long, terrifying war in the shadows was officially, permanently over. The blinding, undeniable light of the truth had finally arrived, and Silas Vance had absolutely nowhere left to hide. The blinding, artificial glare of the high-definition studio lights washed over the heavily scarred face of Jax Harlan and the blood-matted fur of his loyal German shepherd, broadcasting their raw, unfiltered truth to millions of screens across the entire state of Colorado. Within minutes of the live morning television broadcast, the carefully constructed, pristine public image of Silas Vance completely and violently shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Jack stood tall and unyielding before the cameras, his rough, gravelly voice perfectly calm and absolutely steady as he meticulously laid out the irrefutable evidence. He presented the terrifying timeline of corporate intimidation. The violent physical assault deep within the hidden tunnels of Thorn Manor, the intentional, catastrophic arson that had burned the century-old estate to the ground, and finally, the official, certified geological report detailing the miraculous $500 million pharmaceutical spring buried beneath the mountain. As the undeniable facts flowed through the television networks and the Internet, an unprecedented wave of public outrage swept violently across the nation. The ruthless billionaire who had spent his entire life operating comfortably in the dark, utilizing his massive wealth to crush the vulnerable and silence the innocent, suddenly found himself completely exposed to the unforgiving, burning spotlight of absolute justice. Before the afternoon sun had even reached its absolute zenith over the towering peaks of the Rocky Mountains, heavy federal tactical vehicles had aggressively surrounded the massive corporate headquarters of the Sterling and Vance Law Group in downtown Denver. Silas Vance was publicly escorted from his high-rise office in heavy iron handcuffs, his arrogant, predatory smile permanently erased, replaced by the terrifying cold realization that his vast empire of shadows had completely fallen to a single, broken soldier and a deeply loyal war dog who simply refused to run. But the true, profound victory did not occur in the sterile courtrooms of the city, nor did it happen on the busy screens of the 24-hour news cycle. The absolute beautiful triumph quietly unfolded in the deep, isolated heart of Blackpine Valley. As the brutal, freezing winter slowly and inevitably surrendered its heavy grip to the gentle, warming promise of the mountain spring, a miraculous, breathtaking transformation began to take place. The thick, heavy snowbanks that had buried the rugged landscape finally melted away into rushing, crystal-clear streams, and the ancient, towering pine forests exploded into vibrant, beautiful shades of deep, living green. The profound silence of the struggling, abandoned town was permanently broken. not by the terrifying metallic roar of corporate bulldozers, but by the beautiful rhythmic sounds of heavy hammers, cutting saws, and the joyous, hopeful voices of a community finally returning back to life. Where the smoking, blackened ruins of Thorn Manor had once stood as a tragic, rotting monument to deep isolation and profound sorrow, a magnificent new structure slowly rose toward the heavens. It was not a sterile, exclusive luxury resort, designed solely for the arrogant and the wealthy. Thanks to a massive, unprecedented wave of public donations and the secure, protected municipal ownership of the incredible geothermal aquifer, Jax Harlan had overseen the absolute, careful reconstruction of the property into the Blackpine Veteran Sanctuary. The beautiful, sprawling architecture featured massive, heavy timber beams, wide, open-air wooden balconies that looked out over the breathtaking valley, and large, sweeping windows that invited the brilliant mountain sunlight to pour into every single room. It was a place fundamentally built on the profound, unshakable principles of healing, peace, and absolute community. Deep beneath the foundation of the newly constructed sanctuary, the miraculous, glowing turquoise waters of the natural mineral spring had been carefully, respectfully channeled into a series of beautiful open-air stone pools. These pools were strictly protected, forever free from the greedy, grasping hands of corporate privatization, honoring the final, desperate wish of Uncle Elias Thorne. Now, the healing waters were offered freely to those who truly, desperately needed them the most. Months passed, and the sanctuary officially opened its heavy wooden doors to the broken world. Jax Harlan stood quietly on the upper observation deck of the main lodge, his strong, scarred hands resting gently on the smooth, polished cedar railing. The harsh, biting wind of the past had completely faded, replaced by a warm, gentle summer breeze that carried the sweet, pure scent of blooming wildflowers and the faint, incredibly soothing aroma of the warm mineral steam rising from the valley floor below. He watched with a deep, profound sense of peace as dozens of people moved slowly and happily around the beautiful grounds. He saw combat veterans, men and women who carried the exact same invisible, terrifying scars that he had battled for over a decade, slowly stepping into the warm, turquoise water. He watched as the heavy, concentrated lithium and magnesium magically eased their chronic physical pain, while the profound, beautiful silence of the mountain completely quieted the deafening, chaotic noise in their traumatized minds. Jax looked down at the busy, thriving town of Blackpine Valley, located far below the cliff. The once abandoned storefronts were now completely open and bustling with vibrant life. Local residents who had nearly lost everything to the suffocating grip of poverty now had highly secure, meaningful employment supporting the sanctuary. The local diner was full of laughter. The old gas station had been entirely rebuilt, and the haunting, oppressive shadow of Silas Vance had been permanently banished from the earth. The mountain had not just healed the broken soldiers, it had completely resurrected an entire forgotten community. A soft, familiar sound broke through Jax's deep, quiet reflection. The heavy, rhythmic clicking of thick nails against the wooden deck announced the arrival of his greatest friend. Smoky walked slowly but proudly out onto the balcony, his thick, beautiful coat shining brightly in the warm afternoon sun. The massive German shepherd moved with effortless grace, completely devoid of the terrible, agonizing limp that had once threatened his life. The terrible, jagged wound on his left shoulder had entirely healed, leaving behind only a thick, pale scar hidden beneath the dark fur, a permanent physical badge of absolute honor and unbreakable loyalty. Jax knelt down slowly on the warm wooden deck and wrapped his thick, muscular arms securely around the heavy neck of the incredible war dog. Smoky leaned his considerable weight completely into his master's chest, letting out a long, contented sigh that vibrated deeply against Jax's heart. The amber eyes of the German shepherd were completely clear, completely calm, and filled with an ancient, profound wisdom that simply understood the heavy journey they had finally completed. "We actually did it, brother," Jax whispered, his voice thick with a profound, overwhelming emotion that he no longer felt the need to hide. "We finally found our way all the way home." Smoky lifted his massive head and gently pressed his wet nose against Jax's scarred cheek, a silent, beautiful confirmation of their unbreakable bond. Jax stood up slowly, keeping one hand resting firmly on the dog's broad back, and looked out across the endless, majestic expanse of the Rocky Mountains as the brilliant sun slowly began to dip below the jagged peaks, painting the vast sky in breathtaking, vivid shades of deep purple, fiery orange, and burning gold. For the absolute first time since he had stepped off a military transport plane over a decade ago, Jax Harlan realized that the terrifying, chaotic war in his mind was finally, permanently over. He no longer felt the desperate, exhausting urge to constantly run from the terrifying shadows of his past. The invisible, crushing weight that had suffocated his soul for so many terrible years had been completely washed away by the miraculous, deep waters of the mountain and the profound, unconditional love of a single, extraordinary animal. Life is an incredibly strange and beautiful journey. The broken veteran had believed with absolute tragic certainty that his life was permanently over, that he was destined to simply fade away into the cold, forgotten corners of a harsh world, completely alone and completely misunderstood. When the ruthless, powerful men of the world laughed at his suffering and aggressively tried to steal the very last piece of hope he possessed, they expected him to quietly surrender. They expected him to break. But they fundamentally misunderstood the profound, unbreakable nature of a true warrior, and they completely failed to comprehend the absolute terrifying power of a dog who loves his master more than he loves his own life. Smoky had not merely saved Jax Harlan from the physical dangers of the burning estate, nor had he simply protected him from the violent, deadly blades of corporate mercenaries. The loyal German shepherd had relentlessly, stubbornly dug through the rotting floorboards of their despair until he completely unearthed the beautiful, undeniable truth that life is always entirely worth fighting for. The dog did not care about the terrible mistakes of the past, nor did he care about the invisible demons that haunted the quiet hours of the night. Smoky only cared about standing absolutely strong in the present moment, completely ready to face whatever terrifying challenges tomorrow might bring, as long as they faced those challenges exactly together. Some brutal, terrifying battles will completely change a man forever, leaving behind deep, terrible scars that the rest of the world can never truly understand. But sometimes, in the absolute darkest, most terrifying moments of our lives, the unwavering, profound loyalty of one good dog can grab us by the soul and forcefully pull us back into the blinding, beautiful light. They teach us how to completely trust again. They teach us how to stand our ground against the terrifying bullies of the world. And most importantly, they teach us that absolute, unconditional love is the most powerful, undeniable force on the face of the earth. As the final, fading light of the golden sun slipped completely behind the ancient, towering peaks of the mountains, Jax Harlan and Smoky stood perfectly still on the wooden balcony, two battle-scarred warriors who had finally found their absolute peace. The sanctuary below them was filled with the beautiful, healing sounds of laughter and quiet hope. The deep, miraculous waters of the earth continued to flow silently in the dark, offering salvation to anyone brave enough to seek it. And the broken soldier who had once slept in a freezing, rusted truck now possessed a kingdom built entirely on the unbreakable foundation of pure love and absolute courage. If this incredible story of survival, deep loyalty, and the absolute, unbreakable bond between a wounded veteran and his faithful dog touched your heart today, I would like to ask you for a very simple favor. Please leave a comment down below right now. You can simply write exactly where you're watching this video from, or you can just type the word courage if you absolutely believe that a loyal dog has the profound power to completely change the entire trajectory of a human life. We read every single comment, and it absolutely means the world to us to see how far these powerful emotional stories travel across the globe. And if these deep, meaningful stories of absolute redemption, profound healing, and undeniable inner strength bring genuine value to your day, please make sure to officially subscribe to the channel and join our growing community, because the very next story we share about pure courage, absolute loyalty, and the powerful, miraculous healing of the human spirit might be even more beautiful and more powerful than this one. Thank you so very much for spending your valuable time with us today. And who knows, maybe we will see you again in the very next story.